Hello everyone and welcome to the 6th content chapter of the lecture series, True Dhamma 2.0, following in the footsteps of the Buddha. My name is Dr. Florian Lau from the Dhamma Hub, and today we talk about the Dhamma, or wisdom in general, or as I like to call it, the teachings special to the Buddhas. This would be the most important topic if you actually want to make a breakthrough to the Dhamma, and not only limit yourself to virtue. But without further ado, let us have a short overview of today's lecture. One small remark, as we probably have around 110 and 100 to 120 slides today. This will be a rather long lecture, and I try to record it in one go, but I'm not sure if I can actually do that without any, at least small mistakes. I'm not used to talking for such long periods. Even in the lectures at university, it's usually limited to 90 minutes on end. Even if I have two in succession, it's usually accompanied by a 30-minute break. But let's see, maybe it works. Okay, anyway, the first thing we want to talk about today is mundane understanding, as in a short recap about the mundane right view. Then we have a short story time, or what happened after a certain number of rains, as an example, when the Buddha started teaching. Then we approach the entire topic of the Dhamma, or dependent origination, through the framework of the Four Noble Truths, which is probably the most often repeated one, and very likely the best one. And then we talk about the Noble Eightfold Path, which is technically contained within the Four Noble Truths, but offers a much more in-depth view on the entire training that is necessary to actually make it to stream entry. Then we talk about unenlightened experience, so that we can actually contrast it with the enlightened experience. Then we talk a bit about why the Dhamma is beyond reasoning. Then we have the teachings that are special to the Buddha, the very hardwood of the Dhamma, which is dependent origination. Then we talk about contemplation, how it works, then about the right view, what it is, all the synonyms that are going around there, the difference between virtue and the Dhamma, and then we talk about many of the prevailing stream entry myths going around today that hinder lots of people of actually making a breakthrough to the Dhamma. And in the end, as always, we have a short summary. But as always, we start with 5 minutes of restraint, as the mind is completely incapable of understanding the Dhamma, if you are not apart from the hindrances, if the hindrances are not abandoned in you, at least for now. You want to at least have no surface-level cravings right now that would distract you from understanding and seeing the Dhamma in your experience right now. And this is very important. If this is not in place, then no matter how hard you try to learn or whatever you try to do, the knowledge that the Buddha tried to convey has nothing to land on. There's no footing. Yeah. Anyway, I will now pause for a moment, and then you can continue whenever you wish, whenever you feel ready to understand more. Okay, let us now continue. I assume that you are done now. Well, let us now start with the mundane part of understanding. First of all, I like to start with a comparison that Ajahn Chah made when he tried to explain to people how understanding works, or what is meant by understanding. And Ajahn Chah liked to compare knowledge, overall knowledge, with a fruit basket. Not knowing what is in there, you repeatedly take out all the fruit and count them again and again and again. Once you know with absolute certainty what is in that fruit basket, it's no longer necessary to count. And that hindrance of doubt, let's put it like that, would be the frequent counting, as you actively do that. You act out of that kind of pressure, of that kind of doubt. And knowledge would be a shortcut. You simply no longer have to count all the time. You just know. You know what must be done. And understanding the Dhamma means that you no longer have to perform any kind of meditation duty, meditation motion, any kind of blind virtuous practices that are not really accompanied by any kind of understanding or wisdom that could lead you to the end of suffering. So this is what virtue is. This is what the first of the fetters is, or the third. I always mix up the order. Silabbata paramasa, as in the attachment to blind kinds of practices, to blind kinds of virtue that have no understanding accompanying them. And understanding the Dhamma, or the principle of dependent origination, is the very hardwood of the practice. Understanding that leads to you no longer being able, in the same way as before, engaging with sensuality, as an example, or taking up any view that would lead to the arising of any self, or something like that, which is a major milestone, as that kind of understanding cannot be undone anymore. This is independent of the aggregates. And in summary, wisdom is a lot like learning to add numbers on paper. Once you understand how it works, you just know how it works. There's no real formal definition that I can offer you. But there is a very distinct moment, an experiential moment, an experience that you make once you understand how it works. And it is the same as Buddhist wisdom, that you must consciously understand what has to be done to end suffering. In the end, you want to convince your heart, your heart mind, or however you want to call it, your chitta, of the benefits of renunciation. You want to make it understand through all your contemplative effort, etc. But before you can go there, you have to understand it yourself. Otherwise, there's no way that you could ever convey that meaning to your heart. Yeah, and the look and feel of insight, I just wanted to show this here. It's just a very small example. Once you notice, for example, in this picture, that it looks like all the ducks in the world are wearing small fox masks or dog masks, and you cannot really unsee that. And that the same is true with adding numbers on paper, as an example. Once you know how it is done, once you know how to add up all the digits and then make the sum out of it, you cannot really unlearn that anymore. Yeah, sure, the knowledge can move into the background, but from then on, you can just remember it, which is a very important difference. Remembering and not having understood something, or really having to understand something in the first place, and then having understood it and just having to remember it. The effort involved is something entirely different. And you could also perform the entire thing that I explained as a short exercise. And I like to explain it as follows. To understand the process of understanding, imagine looking at a basket of exotic fruits. I like the fruit basket. To an unprepared mind, it is just a heap of strange shapes, if they are truly exotic to you. You could start reading an encyclopedia or ask an experienced gardener to recognize the different kinds of fruits, the different kinds of shapes. But you first have to educate yourself to gain a rough understanding of what to look for beforehand. I mean, think about it for a moment. Could you, in a strange heap of shapes, recognize any of those fruits? Well, very likely not. But when you take a look again after educating yourself, then it is suddenly possible to recognize bananas as bananas, pineapples as pineapples, mangoes as mangoes, and all the other strange fruit that you have never heard of. And the Buddhist nun Ayakema described insights as a recognized experience. And I really like that. It is nearly impossible to just happen. Well, I would even say it is absolutely impossible without doing the proper prior training beforehand. There's simply nothing to recognize in your experience when you have not trained yourself in virtue beforehand. There's only something to recognize when you make your experience so that there is something to recognize. So to recognize the purity of your experience, you first must make it pure. And only based on a pure experience without greed, hatred, and delusion can you recognize the absence of greed, hate, and delusion. You can only then see or experience the cessation of that, which is crucial, because you understand the Four Noble Truths all at once, as we will soon see. But overall, we are always caught in a web of assumptions about reality. We always have a preconceived notion of how reality works, what is right, what is wrong. And we are born with that. There's no first point where it all went wrong. It's just how things are. Even if we are born a baby, we are still born with the absolute certainty that certain wrong views will arise in us, which is rather interesting. I think in some sutta the Buddha was confronted by other ascetics by the simile of the newborn, which is just they claimed that newborns are perfectly pure and have no greed or aversion in them. And that might even be true, that they have no, well, I don't think it's true, because they're screaming all the time. They are freakishly averse. That's how children are. Everything they experience is either the best thing in the world or the worst thing in the world, because they have no real frame of reference. But they have no, their greed and their aversion is not the same kinds that we are used to. So people tend to think that babies are kind of pure when it comes to greed and aversion or something like that. But from the Buddhist point of view, that is not really the case, as it's very primal drives that we are describing there. But they are very much born with the potential for certain kinds of wrong views to arise. Some of those views are very useful in an evolutionary context, as an example, or in a very dangerous world, but they are wrong nonetheless, and they make us suffer in the end, even though they seem like they are very beneficial. We don't know, even that, we don't even know that they are there, and yet they cause us suffering. There's a complete misunderstanding. Those things where we assume that they are actually helping us, like eating chocolate when we feel bad or something, are actually hurting us. And we have no idea that that is the case because of the level of indirection that is involved there. And whatever you try to understand is, I like to compare it at least with that, it works on the same level of significance as gravity. You want to understand, as an example, that gravity is not really a thing. You have lived your entire life, if you believe in rebirth, probably for eons on end, believing that gravity is a thing, and suddenly you have to understand, oh, gravity is not really a thing. And that is the level of, that is the difference between before and after. And it's a bit like learning that you did something as fundamental as breathing wrong. And that kind of wrong view is sadly beginningless, always there, and you are caught in that like in a spider web, and there's no first thread discernible. And the wisdom that we try to develop is like disentangling that web of wrong views, especially the wrong self-view. That is truly what is special to the Buddha. The wrong view about control and mastery that always sneaks itself upwards the ladder of generality whenever we see through it on a more specific level, which is very important. So it tends to sneak and find new hiding places. And the Dhamma overall is, sadly, beyond mere reasoning. It is difficult to see. The Buddha even said so in Majjhima Nikaya number 26. He said, this Dhamma that I have attained is profound, hard to see, hard to understand, peaceful and sublime, unattainable by mere reasoning, subtle to be experienced by the wise, not only by those, but this generation delights in attachment, takes delight in attachment, rejoices in attachment. It is very hard for such a generation to see this truth, namely specific conditionality, one thing in your experience, conditioning another, dependent origination. And it is hard to see this truth, namely the stilling of all sankharas, we call it formations if you wish, but that translation is not so good, I think, and the relinquishment of all acquisitions, the destruction of craving, dispassion, cessation, nibbana. This is what we try to achieve. We want to destroy those things and realize that they are destroyed. But that is not an easy thing to do, because we are, on average at least, very much delighting in attachment. We delight in ownership. We delight in controlling our circumstances. We delight in having power over others. We delight in all those things. And this is what is the biggest hindrance, those actions that follow that delight, when it comes to understanding the Dhamma. Simply because our actions, our conduct and body and speech, is the biggest fuel of our ignorance. Because it leads to us looking in a completely different direction. This is attention with the grain, with the world, attention directed toward the objects of our senses, and not attention against the grain, attention towards the causes of our experience, the womb of our experience, the origination, the source, whatever you want to phrase it. This is what we have to cultivate, this womb attention, this yoniso manasikara. And in essence, we want to develop something that is more sturdy than virtue alone. Virtue alone, as I described in the previous chapter, leads to the complete absence of suffering for possibly a very long time, depending on how far you take that kind of virtue. This kind of blind practices that are not yet accompanied by the true wisdom that the Buddha was describing. And wisdom is not mere virtue, which is very important, even though the effect of virtue and the effect of wisdom can seem very similar to any outsider. But the reminder that I want to give you is that virtue is a possible, very long absence of suffering. And wisdom would be the absolute impossibility to re-engage with your suffering. You can no longer start doing your suffering again as you completely understand the meaninglessness of that, because you understand that it was not really possible in the first place to, as an example, alleviate your suffering through sensuality or something like that. Virtue is in that sense kind of superficial, even if it can last for eons on end. And insight would be the deepest kind of understanding available. And wisdom, or the Dhamma, completely seal the deal. So the absence of suffering that you have attained is made, well, permanent by that. And the final of the 10 fetters, not the final, the third, or the first, maybe I made a mistake there, of the 10 fetters is virtue as a duty, or silabata paramasa. And I want to emphasize here that it's not ceremonies and rites. It really means that you transcend virtue, that you transcend this blind kind of purification of conduct. it is completely possible that people realize that conduct is the primary fuel of suffering. They do that. Some people are wise like that. In modern times, that has become a bit more rare because people are truly engrossed in sensuality of even the grossest kinds. But once you have noticed that, you can fix your conduct, but you cannot really fix your mind. You cannot really tame your mind in the way that the Buddha described, because you are not even knowing that you are paired with such a mind. And overcoming such training rules, overcoming of such virtue and duties, and emulation or mimicking other people is completely necessary, because you will always fall back from the teaching, from your virtue, because over such long periods you will simply forget. You live completely free from any kind of suffering for so long periods of time that over that time the foundation of that kind of liberation will erode away. There's nothing that you can really do to stop that, simply because you will forget. And then you are back to square one and are reborn in a very low destination. And a short disclaimer, insight is serious business. If you lack a solid foundation of virtue, such insights can be very overwhelming. And it's very important to make sure that you are well prepared for all those things. Okay, but now to a short story time number 6, to give you a short moment to breathe. And now I want to talk about Anathapindika. I'm following the book The Life of the Buddha, by the way, here, in case you have not noticed. I hope I have said that in the beginning. And he was called the Peter of the Unprotected. And after the first 2 rains retreats, Anathapindika had a vision of terror and encountered the Buddha following that. He was a very wealthy merchant, and just to give you an idea, it is a billionaire level kind of wealth that he possessed. And once he found refuge in the Buddha, the Dhamma and the Sangha, he offered a park and a monastery to the Buddha and to the Sangha of Bhikkhus who were practicing the good way, so to speak. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, this park was directly next to a farm with pigs where they were slaughtered all the time. But the Buddha accepted it nonetheless. And if it wasn't that one, it was another one that I mix up here. And the Buddha did spend many reigns there. So if you look at many of the suttas, you will see that many of them start with a short sentence on the geography where that lecture has taken place. And many of them are taking place in the park of Anathapindika. And as it was a rather big park with a good geography and lots of people nearby who were fond of ascetics, it was a good place to dwell with large sanghas, because it's not easy to feed possibly thousands of people. Even if monks do not eat a lot, it's like having to feed an entire village at times. And Anathapindika died as a stream enterer, but he made much merit. So he did have a breakthrough to the Dhamma, but he was busy and had many duties because of his entanglement in the world. And on the deathbed, Ananda and Sariputta taught him the teachings special to the Buddhas. And he requested that householders should also be able to receive those special teachings because they are able to understand them. In some cases, at least. Most householders are not, but some householders will understand because they have little dust on their eyes. And this is what matters, so to speak. So after Anathapindika's request, householders also started receiving the teachings special to the Buddha, the teachings on dependent origination. And roughly in the same time period, the order of nuns has also been formed. This took place at roughly the 5th rains retreat, or the 5th year after the Buddha started teaching. Shortly before, the lay king became an arahant on the deathbed. So it is possible for lay people to become arahants, even according to the Buddhas. And there are a few other cases. For example, the case of Yasa that I mentioned in a few videos ago. And at that time, the Buddha visited his native city and met his foster mother, Gautami. She wanted to ordain, but was refused several times by the Buddha. And Ananda convinced the Buddha that women should be allowed to ordain when accepting extra rules. And the Buddha accepted that. And this was a major step in a society where women were generally regarded as unfit for spiritual striving. Nonetheless, Gautami, based on very little instructions, attained arahantship after no long time. And those extra rules, and this is, by the way, my opinion, so take it with a grain of salt, are there to protect, or have been there to protect nuns in a society where females were regarded as unfit. This is, or can be, very triggering for people who have very strong opinions on gender equality. So I would be careful when reading certain suttas. Those extra rules, nonetheless, were no hindrance to the practice at all. If anything, they would make the practice easier for you, because they protected the women practicing at that time from undue criticism, as an example. This is very similar to, for example, immigration laws. If you move to another country, people will very likely look at you with a different mindset and expect very good behavior from you. And by leading by example and actually going through all the rules, as an example, people will accept you quite quickly. And this makes the entire spiritual striving business much easier overall, if you truly display this kind of spotless virtue, this kind of very good behavior. Then there's no ground for criticizing. And again, those rules are, as I understand it, mainly to appease others. There are no hindrance at all to the nuns, because the only thing that the Buddha forbid the nuns from doing was, technically, to have craving, or he wanted to discourage them from having craving. And in essence, he with those extra rules, he ensured that they suffer less, that they do or fuel fewer of their suffering. That is pretty much all of it. From the outsider perspective, however, it will look like he was especially harsh to the nuns or something like that. But this is a mindset of a person who is still clinging to their views. So I would be very careful there if you are triggered in such a way. But anyway, again, this is just my opinion, so be very careful there. And after that, the Buddha also started laying down the Patimokkha, the rules of conduct for monks and nuns, which are designed, as mentioned before, to protect the practitioners. Not only the nuns, but also the monks. The monks had also, like in the end, 227 rules, while the nuns had something akin to 300 rules or something like that. And they were only introduced upon necessity, many years, some of them, many years after the awakening of the Buddha. And initially, the Buddha even said so, he just had to stir people's mindfulness. He just had to remind them of the Dhamma from time to time. And then what was enough for them to reach the final goal. But after some time, when all the very advanced practitioners already had attained liberation, there was much more instruction necessary, much more rules were necessary. And the entire process was started when Sudina, a monk, slept with his former wife to create an heir. He was begged by his parents, by many of his friends or something like that. And in the end, he gave in. Yet, that was not so nice, according to the Buddha, and he called him defeated and laid out a rule against it. He was allowed to stay a monk because there was no rule against it at that time, because the Buddha took it for granted that people would not do such a thing. But nonetheless, he did, and then there was a rule against it. And whenever a serious offense emerged, the Buddha created a new rule. And this is how this entire body of rules has been created. And each new moon, half moon, or no moon, there's a recital of the rules. And basically on each uposatha. Okay, but let us now come to the actual Dhamma, to the actual teachings of the Buddha, this time through the Four Noble Truths, which is like I want to start. Okay. Well, the Four Noble Truths are as follows, and I want to state them in a rather unconventional way as a statement of realization by someone who has understood the Dhamma. And this phrasing is as follows. The first noble truth is, oh, this is suffering. The second one is, oh, this is the source of suffering. Oh, this is the end of suffering. Oh, this is the way leading to the end of suffering. And this happens on the level of an experiential realization. It is really, as I described it, oh, so this is suffering. I got it wrong all the time. I always looked in the wrong places for my suffering. This is a real deal. This is the essence of the Four Noble Truths there. And the Fourth Noble Truth, as I said before, contains the Noble Eightfold Path, which is the way to the end of suffering. This is one phrasing of it. In the suttas, you will find several others. But I think this is suffering, this is the source of suffering, is one very common phrasing that you will encounter in the suttas. And I like this one best as it highlights the experiential aspect of it. You are not only trying to understand dependent origination on an intellectual level. What you want to do is understand it on the level of gut feeling. You want to experience dependent origination. You want to make your heart understand dependent origination, so that it no longer rebels against it, so that it is no longer averse against this kind of non-control that the Buddha was talking about. Yeah. And the Four Noble Truths can also be stated in a bit more detail. And the first one would be that suffering is an inseparable part of existence, or of living with craving. Let's put it like that. And the second Noble Truth would be that suffering depends on other things, namely craving to exist. Whenever there is craving or thirst or tanha, there's also suffering at the same time. It coexists, depends upon craving. When what suffering depends upon ceases, suffering also vanishes. Suffering has supporting conditions that it relies on for its existence. Suffering can only exist when there is craving at the same time. And the fourth truth would be, there is a gradual training leading to the complete destruction and eradication of craving so that it cannot arise again. And this last part is so important. Through virtue, you can unsuffer yourself for a very long time, eons on end. Through the Dhamma, you can seal the deal and ensure that there is no rebirth of craving, no rebirth of being, no rebirth of suffering. This is what we try to achieve. And this is why it's so easy to mistake mere virtue with the Dhamma, because most people have a very limited time horizon. They think in terms of weeks, days, months, years, or something like that, but not on the level of eons. And when you try to remember the kind of simile that I have given you when it comes to the length of an eon, then you will come to realize that what the Buddha was talking about is a bit on a different level when it comes to the freedom from suffering. And we will now try to understand what is necessary to completely remove suffering from your life right now, not after death or something like that. And I want to start with the first Noble Truth. The first Noble Truth is the truth of suffering. Suffering is not what you think it is. Suffering is a way of existence. Suffering means dukkha. And this is why I usually don't like to translate it at all. Just to highlight that the word suffering does not really capture the meaning of the word dukkha. It is a way of existing. It's a way of living the entirety of your life. And it is a stressful way of living, as indicated by dukkha being the opposite of sukha. Sukha would mean that you are living in a peaceful or way where you live at ease, while dukkha suggests that you live at unease, which is not just including the battlefield or starvation kind of suffering, but every bit of the lack that you experience in every day of life. Yet, birth, decay, death, and not getting what one wants, those are the things that the Buddha called suffering. In the most general way, he phrased it as not getting what one wants or being paired with what one does not want. And there are good days, no question about it, but there's also the possibility to suffer. At any given time, there's always this kind of nagging thing in the background. You know that you have to die at some point. You know that you will likely fall ill. You know that you will, with absolute certainty, grow old and die. Attachment to feeling is always suffering. In essence, every bit of our striving as a normal worldling, let's put it like that, is usually directed at making the feeling part of our experience a bit better. In conventional experience is suffering. There is basically always a feeling of lack and only tiny glimpses of peace. When you have a good feeling right now, it's not good enough. So there's a lack of even better feeling. When there's a bad feeling, there's the lack of good feeling. And when there's a neutral feeling, then there's a lack of engagement, a lack of entertainment. It's always a lack. And whenever you get what you want, there's this tiny bit of peace that you attain, that we are always striving for. And this is even understandable through a virtue, that this is folly, that this is foolish striving. So you have not really understood the Four Noble Truths when you realize that craving is a problem. You have understood the Four Noble Truths when you understand how to prevent future suffering from ever arising again. This is a Dhamma. And it's very easy to misunderstand that. People misunderstand that all the time. They think themselves to be enlightened once they have understood, oh yes, craving is suffering. But how to prevent craving from future arising? This is not something they have understood. And then we have the second Noble Truth, which is a Noble Truth of the origin of suffering. And what it states is, suffering has a cause, an origin, a womb, a reason. And it has proximate and ultimate causes that must exist at the same time. And one thing for suffering to exist, its proximate cause, is craving. Without craving, suffering cannot exist. And craving would be, as mentioned before, the wish for things to be different, the wish for things to change for the better. If we were fine with things as they are, there would be no footing for suffering. Suffering could not arise. Yet, craving is there because we are not satisfied with the circumstances, and as such, it is sadly impossible to satisfy. Simply because craving is self-amplifying. Let's put it like that. Whenever you take a drug, as an example, I don't know, like cocaine or something like that, then you have a tiny moment of peace afterwards. The problem is the craving is still there. The satisfaction of the craving is not in the drug. The craving is still within you. It is still in your heart. And you, as soon as you got what you wanted, you want more of it. Because the solution to craving is not in the things. It's not in getting the substance that you desire. And it's not in getting any kind of experience that you desire. Hence, we suffer due to craving. If we would not value certain things of others, there would never be a feeling of lack again, which is very important. So if we could, in a very skillful way, train ourselves to no longer value things like cocaine, then we would no longer suffer when there would be a lack of cocaine in our experience. And this is the kind of the training of renunciation that the Buddha was describing. We want to throw away all the things that we value. And then we have the third noble truth, which is the noble truth of the cessation of suffering. And what the Buddha explained there is that suffering coexists with and due to craving and avijja. Craving would be the proximate cause of suffering, while avijja, non-knowing of the Four Noble Truths, or non-knowing of dependent origination, would be the ultimate cause of suffering that leads to the re-arising of craving. So even if you remove the craving, the avijja would still be there, and that would lead to the re-arising, to the rebirth, to the regrowing of craving. And then you are back to square one. And everything that depends on other impermanent things is also fragile. So if your kind of liberation depends on the absence of craving, which is also impermanent, then your suffering will come back. And what we also understand when we understand the Four Noble Truths is that things that rely on other things vanish together with their cause. When craving vanishes, suffering also vanishes, but again could come back. However, when craving is uprooted through the removal of avijja, suffering can no longer regrow. And this is true right here and now. And you can test it through fixing your conduct sufficiently and then understanding what the Buddha explained in your own experience. There's no need for any afterlife or anything like that for the salvation that is offered in Buddhism. The cessation of suffering or craving is based on removing its cause. Then we just let it die. We just let it cool off, as the suttas say. The very word nibbana means that you no longer blow air actively into a forge fire, so that the forge fire cools down. And this is what we try to achieve. We cannot make it cool down. We cannot make the animal, that is our heart, calm down. We can only encourage it to do so. And in doing so, we ensure by presenting it with the right things, reminding it of the right things, etc., we ensure that we no longer suffer through whatever our heart throws at us. We just let it calm down. We just let it cool off. And the fourth noble truth, one could say that it is the most important one in the sense that it contains the actual instructions that you must follow. The fourth noble truth is the truth of the path leading to the cessation of suffering. There is a gradual training to remove suffering forever from your experience, to even prevent it from future arising. And this is kind of difficult, because we cannot control the aggregates. It's also something that we understand. Yet, it is possible to remove the entirety, even of the possibility to suffer in the future, from your experience. And the Noble Eightfold Path is that training. It starts with the right view, and it ends with Samma Samadhi, and later there are two additional elements, which would be knowledge of liberation, as an example. And the Buddha explained liberation usually through the destruction of qualities, maybe the most repeated formula of the Dhamma. And the following slides, the next eight ones, explain the Noble Eightfold Path based on Majjhima Nikaya number 117. And that kind of path, I want to be very sure that it is properly understood, is a framework that includes many possible ways to the final goal. In the very beginning, our experiences as possibly unenlightened people is very diverse. We like different things than other people. Our circumstances are very different. Everything is different. But the more we practice, the more we become become like each other. So in the beginning, there's only one first element that is always the same, namely the right view, and one last element, namely Samma Samadhi, and the rest of it has no clear order. You just practice and fix your conduct more and more on different levels. Your speech has to be fixed. Your livelihood has to be fixed. All those things have to be fixed. And then at some point, all the training will culminate in Samma Samadhi. Yeah. Okay, but let us start with the Noble Eightfold Path. And the first element would be the mundane right view, or the right view, depending on what kind of path you are talking about. And in that very sutta, the Buddha made that distinction between the mundane right view, where you understand, okay, my suffering is dependent on my lack of virtue. My conduct in body, speech, and mind fuels my suffering. This is what you understand with the mundane right view. And then there's the supramundane right view, which would be the understanding how to actually make sure that the suffering stays away. Both are the first elements of the lower and the higher training. The lower training would be the training that leads upwards to the actual right view, and the higher training would be everything that you do after you have attained the right view. And what the Buddha's teachings are actually about is exactly that. You want to attain this right view on dependent origination. And it really is the knowledge that there's nothing worthwhile except for liberation. That you understand that nothing is truly worth going for. Nothing is permanent. No sankhara in the entire world would be worth clinging to. And this kind of right view, the very word right view, implies the understanding of the Four Noble Truths. The true training, the targeted training, let's put it like that, starts with a right view. And it is usually accompanied, not usually, it is always accompanied by immense relief and immense joy. And one of right view knows and sees the Dhamma. He knows and sees dependent origination. He has realized experientially dependent origination. And as such, the vast majority of their suffering has fallen away. He understood the way out of suffering, usually on a quite conscious level. And one could say that the distinction between a Dhamma follower and a person, a stream enterer, so a Sotapanna, is that one has only really understood what must be done on a conscious level, but that is sufficient, and has seen dependent origination sufficiently, but his heart has not yet gotten the message, so to speak. And the right view is exactly what makes the other path elements right. So only based on the right view can you have something like right livelihood, because without the right view, you do not even know what right even means. And the next element would be right intention. And it is only available through the right view, because otherwise you would only have intention, but not intention leading to liberation. And karma would be action or intention or inclination, and the neutral kind of karma, namely the karma that leads to the ending of karma, is only available through the right view. Intentions condition actions, and right intention, right inclination would be all those actions of body and speech, and also your mind, that lead you to liberation. And based on the right view, we can choose things leading to liberation. Before that, we have no idea what leads to liberation and what leads away from it. Well, in some cases, we might have some idea, we might have some understanding, but it would be incomplete. And in that sutta, it's usually stated as that you should cultivate intentions of renunciation or non-sensuality, intentions of non-ill will or metta, and intentions of harmlessness or non-cruelty. This would be the absence of certain kinds of intentions. Everything else is kind of all right, but you have to make very sure that at least the very unwholesome kinds of intentions are no longer present in your experience. And then we would have right speech, which is another major outlet of the unwholesome, another major way of interacting with the world of the senses. You could call it verbal action of speech that needs to be purified too, because you can speak in accordance with the Dhamma or against the Dhamma. For example, lying is a way away from liberation. It is even so important that the Buddha included this kind of speech, namely right speech, in the phrasing of the 5 precepts. And whenever he went into detail, he also stated that right speech also included no slander, no gossip, no backbiting, no setting one person against another, and not using harsh or abusive speech. In essence, you only really speak with a purpose, and you only really speak on Dhamma. And speaking, for the most part, would be a major fuel of ignorance from the Four Noble Truths. You can distract yourself from the Four Noble Truths, from dependent origination, from the right view, through your speech. Very simple. If you always speak, then you cannot really understand that. Why? Because speech is always with the grain. Speech always concerns itself with the object in the world, with the objects of the senses. It goes against this kind of 1% attention that we need to cultivate to make any further progress. And then we have right action. And right action would be based on right intention. Wrong intentions drive wrong actions. Non-harming, non-cruelty, non-greed, basically jhana or samadhi. And examples of wrong actions are killing, stealing, sensual or sexual misconduct, depending on how you want to phrase it. And again, the same principle applies here. Your actions always, the very word action implies the word control, implies a self, so to speak. And whenever you act with the body, you reaffirm that self-view, you strengthen it through every action that you do. And through every action that you do, you also reaffirm your suffering. You also strengthen your suffering, and you strengthen your ignorance of the Four Noble Truths. And you must really make sure that you purify your actions at all times. You don't want to just focus on your conduct when you are sitting on the meditation cushions. That would be useless. Well, it's not useless. It's better than not purifying your conduct at all, but it's not really good. It's very limited in the sense. Craving is the maker of limit, as the Buddha said. And this purification of conduct must happen at all times. And it is possibly the strongest fuel of ignorance. If you are always acting against the Dhamma with your body, pretty much. And then we have right livelihood, which is another way of categorizing the very same thing. Right livelihood would be the not breaking of the precepts. The practice must transform your entire life, which is a majorly important stepping stone. Everyone must contribute in some way. Breaking the 5 precepts, I mean, you have to engage with the world as a layperson at least, and even as a monk. You have to teach, as an example. I recently spent some time at a monastery, and they were very busy. In the end, I would say that the monks, at least sometimes, have a more busy lifestyle than I have at home. I mean, they are living more secluded, which is very nice. But in terms of busyness, they have lots of duties in a monastery. So everyone has to contribute, and that contribution in the world, that engagement with the world, has to be pure. And breaking the 5 precepts always leads away from liberation. This applies especially to killing, alcohol, drugs, stealing, misleading others, lying, sexual conduct, wrong sexual conduct. And there are other things that are forbidden, that the Buddha explicitly mentioned, and that would be trading in weapons, trading in living beings, trading meat, liquor, and poisons. So when in question, and you have a job that includes such things, it might be time to do a bit of a soul search, because it's not really a good idea to live a contradiction. You can either trade in those things or make progress when it comes to the Dhamma. I mean, at least initially it might be possible to ensure that your livelihood is a bit more pure, even given those circumstances, because it has to be gradual. But at some point, such wrong livelihoods have to be abandoned. And if you are of right view, you know that such jobs are wrong, and you know why they are wrong. And again, this life transformation of your life away from a life that revolves around sensuality towards a life that revolves around renunciation includes your bodily, your verbal, and your mental conduct at all times. Thinking about the past, conduct about the present, and also future conduct. This is very important. All those things have to be fixed. And then we have right effort. And not following sensuality requires effort. This is not something that comes for free. Following sensuality might be quite stressful, but it is with the grain. This is what we automatically do as a default. And effort means going against the worldly grain. And the 4 right efforts would be the cultivation and renunciation of non-craving. You cultivate desire, you arouse energy, you exert your mind for the non-arising of unwholesome states. And again, wholesome and unwholesome are always related to your intentions. Those are the important bit is that those revolve around why you do something, not about the objects of the senses, but around the intentions. And another part of right effort would be that you awaken desire for abandoning everything unwholesome that has already arisen. But it also includes the desire for making sure that you arouse the unarisen wholesome. And it also includes the desire and exertion of maintaining arisen wholesome states. So it has 4 parts. You want to make sure that future unwholesome states cannot arise. You abandon everything unwholesome that has already arisen. You cultivate any unarisen wholesome, and you maintain whatever wholesome you have already attained. And there's an effort to abandon all wrong paths as you practice the Noble Eightfold Path. And right view, right effort, and right mindfulness circle around each other. And this statement can be very difficult to understand if you use the standard interpretations of those 3 words. Usually when many modern schools of Buddhism talk about right view, right effort, and right mindfulness, especially right mindfulness, then they mean something entirely different. What I say here is pretty much that your right view on dependent origination enables the right kind of training, because you can now see your mind, which enables right effort, which is mental, by the way, and that in turn allows you to refine your understanding of the teaching more and more, which would be your right kind of mindfulness, which would be the mindfulness of the path. Now you can remember what you must do, which is what mindfulness is. You remember the teaching, you remember the instructions, you remember the training. This is what you must do. And then we have this kind of right mindfulness. Again, right mindfulness means the right memory of the training. If you go by many of the sutta descriptions, they are completely not understandable if you use the standard interpretation of mindfulness. What does it mean to sit down under a tree and bring mindfulness to the force? I mean, this is a translation that many people go by. But if you interpret mindfulness as remembering the teaching, then you suddenly sit down under a tree, are no longer distracted, and you bring the teachings back to mind. You bring the instructions back to mind, and then you train in accordance with them. This is what meditation is, and this is what you do when you sit down. So it's very important to have a good understanding of those words. And it is a wrong view, by the way, to have wrong understandings of those words. Okay, so right mindfulness means right memory of the training. There are other kinds of mindfulness, because in the end, mindfulness, or sati, just means remembering. But in the context of the suttas, it is always remembering the teachings. When the sutta states, for example, that certain people have a good memory, they remember what has been said long ago, this usually refers to the teaching, that refers to the Dhamma, to the understanding of the Dhamma. You are not suddenly capable of understanding, I don't know, all the past lives or something. Some people are, if they are especially pure, if they have especially good samadhi. But on average, what you remember is the parts that matter. Yeah, you remember rules and precepts, and later the Dhamma. First, you remember the instructions on virtue, to actually unsuffer yourself, and then you remember the Dhamma. And mindfully remembering one abandons the wrong path elements. And that's at some point, the impersonal awareness of doing. Like a sack of beans. Whether you are walking, talking, sleeping, you are aware of what you're doing. You're aware of this non-control. You are aware of the Dhamma. There are 4 foundations of mindfulness, namely body, feelings, moods, and mental objects, or simply thoughts, one could say in the broadest sense. And those are always simultaneously there, as stated, for example, in Majjhima Nikaya, number 44. And this is also a very interesting statement. The Buddha said that you can have too much or too little of basically every factor of enlightenment, except for mindfulness. Why? Because you cannot really remember too much. You cannot remember the instructions too much. They are either there or they aren't. How could you have too much of that? And you really have to clarify your understanding of the training so that you can remember it at all times. It's not that you have to be obsessed with it at all times. What you want to do is not be able to forget certain kinds of dangers. And the noble right mindfulness is a non-forgetfulness of the 3 marks, like a mother would not forget her only child when she cannot be at home. It does not mean that her child is occupying 100% of her mental resources, but there's always a tiny bit of her mind thinking about her child, thinking about what could go wrong. And the same kind of mindfulness, the same kind of memory, the same kind of attitude is what you try to cultivate. And this is the noble right kind of mindfulness that we try to achieve. And in the end, as the last element of the path, we have the noble right kind of samadhi. And this requires much development of all the other path elements, and it culminates in jhana, or for example in the Brahma-viharas. It is the culmination of the path, where you are free from conceivings, free from hindrances, and there are many right types of concentration that the suttas mention, but the most prominent one and the most relevant one for most people would very likely be jhana, simply because most people have a problem with lust and not so much a problem with hate. Some people have a problem with hate if they are very full of self-criticism, criticisms towards others. Maybe then Brahmaviharas are their vehicle. But the vast majority of people that at least I know would benefit more from non-lust, because lust is much more persistent than hatred. And dwelling in Sammasamadhi leads to this kind of cooling off from sensuality that even convinces your heart that this kind of practice is a good idea. On the intellectual level, on the level of mano, you usually know that the practice would be good for you, but you cannot really convince your heart that it is also a good idea to practice in this or that way. So you need this kind of Sammasamadhi as a precondition to make progress on the path, because your heart, which is like a wild animal, requires convincing, because you cannot control it. It's like a wild animal. It can be tamed, but you have to be smart about it. It's a very indirect kind of taming. Okay, but before we now come to the very important parts, namely the teachings, especially to the Buddha, we want to contrast that kind of enlightened experience with the unenlightened experience, and want to formalize that at least to some degree. Okay, so this really is a long lecture. First of all, there are several ways in which the Buddha categorized subjective experience. There are at least 3 ways in which the Buddha explained the all, so everything that you could possibly experience. And the most popular one of those would be the way of the 5 aggregates. The Buddha separated everything that we could ever experience, have experienced, or are experiencing right now into 5 heaps. The 5 khandhas, which would be form, feeling, perception, intention, and consciousness. And nothing external to that does really exist. And it's really hard to understand due to our prior assumptions of sensuality. We are not really thinking about our experience usually. What we usually do is thinking about external sense objects. We are sitting behind our eyes and watching the entire world from afar, so to speak. And this is our base assumption. We are here inside of our heads and everything else is outside. While in reality, we only really have experience of the world. And this experience of the world, as an example, would contain, for example, a feeling that is always there. I mean, this kind of feeling has different aspects to it. We like different parts of our experience more than others, but there's also an overarching feeling tone, as an example, an overarching Vedana. There's an overarching perception that occupies most of our mind. The entirety of our experience would be a perception. Then we have an intention, sankharas, a purpose of what we are trying to achieve right now, a direction. And then we have consciousness, vijnana, the there-ness of things. And there's nothing external to that. I mean, we can act like there's something external to that and live like that, which is what we normally do. But this would not be in accordance with the truth. Those 5 things are separate heaps which are only connected by our wrong conduct, by our wrong understanding. Yeah. And the form aggregator would be the only thing that is the same for different people. Everything else, except for consciousness, which would be the there-ness of all the others, would just be the subjective properties. Feeling would be how we like our experience. The perception is what we recognize in it. But for that recognition to take place, we have to seen something before. And the intention would be the purpose for something. For example, if you look at your tablet and you mainly use it for watching Dhamma videos, then that's a very different purpose than what most other people use their tablet for. They very likely use it to watch some Netflix or something like that. And that's what they recognize. They recognize all those little icons that are necessary to get what they want. While if you watch mainly Dhamma videos, would have different perceptions, would have a different feeling and different intentions surrounding that. But the form part, the behavior part, so to speak, would be the same. And then the consciousness would also be similar, but not the same, as you are also conscious of all the other things and cannot really separate those things. And then I want to briefly talk about the characteristics of self. Before we can understand non-self, we must of course understand what self is to some degree. However, when we fully understand what self is, it kind of becomes non-self, because we see, okay, there is none of that present. And with ignorance of the impossibility of there being any self, there is self. This is what the Buddha stated. It is a conditional phenomenon. It's not really binary. It's not, yeah, either this is true or that is true. But with certain conditions, this is true, and with certain other conditions, the other statement is true. So in the suttas, it can be quite confusing at times, because it is sometimes said that there is a self, sometimes the Buddha says that there is no self, and people are usually confused because they want a black and white answer. But that is not something that we can give. With ignorance and craving as conditions, there is self, being, suffering. Without ignorance as a condition, those things are no longer there. But overall, the self has certain characteristics. For example, it has a feeling of permanence or sameness. The one sitting behind our eyes is always the same as we age, even though our body is clearly aging, and my body is no longer the same as it was 20 years ago. And the same is true for everyone. Even from a very moment to the next, the body is changing, but it's changing so slowly that we do not really recognize that kind of change. And we also have a necessity for seeking or anticipating pleasure or having it right now at all times. We always try to get something that we want, or try to get away from something that we don't want, and relish that, which is also very important. The thought of being away from something that we do not like is pleasant to us, so we follow it. And there's also a sense of externalness to the aggregates or experience as a whole. Again, we always imagine that we are sitting behind our eyes as someone piloting this meat golem, so to speak, through the external world of the senses or something like that. This is also another property. This is a feeling of control from behind our eyes, a feeling of ownership, the center of experience, the for-me-ness. And all of that is factually there, even though the suttas state that there is no self. For you, if you live with avijja as an example, all those things are there. As with ignorance as a condition, those things exist. Without ignorance as a condition, those things no longer exist. And those things can be removed from center stage, so to speak. And this is very important. Through the training of the Noble Eightfold Path, those things can be deconditioned. Those things can be undone. And this is what we try to achieve. And now a few slides on the reason why the Dhamma is beyond reasoning. Again, in the end, we want to liberate our heart, but we want to liberate it with our intellectual mind, with the discursive thinking. The problem is those two are separate, so we cannot really think our way out of suffering. But again, there's a certain assumption that we can do certain things. The reasoning works based, the reasoning that we usually do, works based on past observations that we assume to be true. And there are many views, opinions that we hold, like the unknown opinion of having a self or being controlled. And some are more important than others. Most of the time they are invisible, and you don't really know them explicitly. And as such, you cannot really work with them. You cannot really undo them, as you can only really remove what you can see. And this is kind of part of the Buddha's genius. He uprooted unknown assumption without any prior help, without tools or anything like that, and without anyone teaching that to him. And this is basically impossible. If someone tells you what to look for, then you can look for that. But if no one tells you what to look for, then it's basically impossible to recognize out of infinitely many options. And he did find the root of suffering and pulled them out. Without any help, he is a self-awakened arahant, so to speak. And we have to gradually undo our wrong views, layer by layer. We have to gradually remove our wrong assumptions, our wrong views, so that there only is a right view remaining. And this is what we try to achieve. We are always affected by a wrong view. We are usually unknowingly convinced that we are right, even if history, our own memories, proves that wrong all the time. And this wrong assumption or belief or opinion is absolutely fundamental. We think, for example, that we know what words mean, but often have very wrong ideas. We only know a meaning for certain words. For example, when I say Vedana, it's very likely that your idea of Vedana is something completely different from my idea of Vedana. But as you have some idea of what that word means, you just hand wave it away and assume that you have the same idea. And this would be an example of having wrong view. And there are other much more fundamental examples, like the assumption or the wrong view of control, of externalness, of ownership. And our errors can usually only be seen afterwards. Once they have been fixed, we notice the contrast. And awakening is about stopping to assume wrong things. And that's why everyone can do it. You can undo your wrong views. You can stop doing certain things. That's not something that requires the greatest intellect or the greatest genius. Everyone can do that. It's just about stopping. It's just about our willingness to stop that. And as an example, this is how things, as we believe them to be, can cease completely, like consciousness, like all those other things. And this is how I like to portray it. There's a certain true reality or freedom from suffering, even though I don't like the word true reality very much, because both realities are kind of true, depending on the supporting conditions. But usually we confine ourselves to logical thinking based on the views and beliefs and assumptions that we hold. And given those assumptions that we hold to be true, only certain logical conclusions are possible. But the logical conclusions that we need to make to understand about the past are not accessible unless we contradict the views and beliefs and assumptions that we hold through the viewing of anicca. So we want to undermine those core beliefs of control and ownership that we hold through seeing that they cannot be true. But it is not really possible to do that in a targeted manner. You have to be smart about it. You have to be indirect about it. Because in the end, again, we want to convince our heart through our mind. And this is also why logic fails and why wrong views are sticky. This is, by the way, a citation that is not from the sutta. This is, I think, from Nyanavira. And it goes as follows. A man with avidya, or forgetfulness, or non-knowing of the three marks of the Four Noble Truths, practicing reflection, may identify self with both reflexive and immediate experience, or with reflexive experience alone, or with immediate experience alone. However, he does not conclude that neither is self, and the reason is clear. It is not possible to get outside avidya by mere reflection alone, for however much a man may step back from himself to observe himself, he cannot help taking avidya with him. There is just as much avidya in the self-observer as there is in the self-observed. So, and this is the very reason why avidya is so stable in spite of being sankhata. I mean, avidya, or non-knowing of the Four Noble Truths, clearly has conditions, and as such, it is impermanent. It can be undone. There is the possibility of liberation, in other words. But simply by reflection, the Pithujana, the unenlightened worldling, the worldly person that has not really any interest in practicing the Dhamma, can never observe avidya and at the same time recognize it as avidya. For in reflection, avidya is a judge as well as the accused. And the verdict is always not guilty. You always come to the conclusion, yeah, there is self. You cannot pinpoint it, but there is self. There's nothing that I'm missing. In order to put an end to avidya, which is a matter of recognizing avidya as avidya, it is necessary to accept on trust from the Buddha a teaching that contradicts the very evidence of the Pithujana's reflection. You are completely convinced that you are right. And yet you must accept that the Buddha is more right than you, or could be right, and actually practice what he is saying to make a breakthrough to the Dhamma. And this is where the Dhamma is against the stream, against the grain. This is from Nyanavira, which has inspired many people nowadays to practice a good type of Dhamma. That does not mean that his way of phrasing the Dhamma is the best one available, by the way. He often has a very philosophical touch, which is not very relatable to many people. He has a very academic touch, too. He speaks in difficult terms, I would say. And it requires quite a good intellect and a philosophical inclination to actually understand what he is saying. There are other teachers out there who phrase the very same thing, essentially, in different words. As an example, in the monasteries that I recently visited in Germany, Motodaya, there are two senior monks, Chatamalo and former student of Ayakema, Ajahn Metiko. And those very much phrase the very same thing and even refer back to Nyanavira, but use words that are so much more understandable by the common person. Sadly, I think their books are only available in German. So if you are German, consider yourself lucky and maybe you can snatch a copy of those things. And even one of the books from Metiko is called Against the Grain, essentially. But in German, Gegen den Strich is what it's called. And this is what the Dhamma is all about. Gegen den Strich, against the grain. About womb attention, not about ascension towards sensuality. And again, one more slide about wrong assumptions, just to give you an idea what all of this means. And there was an ascetic asking speculative questions, who was called Vacha. And when Master Gotama is asked these 4 questions, he replied, the term reappears does not apply. Suppose, and now the Buddha speaks, a fire were burning before you. Would you know this fire is burning before me? Obviously the answer is yes. And when the fire before you was extinguished, to which direction did it go? to the east, to the west, to the north, or to the south. And being asked thus, what would you answer, Vacha? That does not apply, Master Gautama. The fire burned independent on its fuel of grass and sticks, and when that is used up, if it does not get any more fuel, being without fuel, it is reckoned as extinguished. This is from Majjhima Nikaya number 72. And there, the Buddha has been asked by some ascetic, what happens to the Tathagata, as an example, or to an Arahant after death. The Buddha always said, it does not apply, it does not apply. And in the same way, a fire going to the north, to the east, to the south, to the west does not apply. It does not make sense, logically speaking. It's like asking how many legs does a book have. It simply does not apply. The wrong assumption. A person needs to have wrong assumptions about books having legs, as an example, or fires going to the north, to the south, to the east, or to the west. Then it does make sense, but only given this limited kind of context, only based on wrong assumptions. And as we learned from propositional logic, at least some of us maybe at university, from something wrong, everything can follow. So based on your wrong assumptions, you can conclude basically everything. And what you essentially want to do in the practice is align your view, your idea of suffering, which is the top dotted box, with what suffering really is. This is the goal that we want to achieve. We want to align our own understanding of the path, of the training, with the path that the Buddha has actually laid out in the suttas. And when we do that, then we are close to the deathless. And we want to be indirect about that. For example, imagine you are 100% convinced of the flat earth conspiracy theory. You put that idea above all others and are completely convinced that this is true and nothing else is true. And how could you let go of such an attachment? How would it even be possible if you are 100% convinced of your way of living, of your views, which is basically the state that most people are living in? For example, I recently encountered lots of people who are very worried about the climate nowadays. And when I tell them, okay, some of the scientific articles might be a bit too emotional, they might not actually contain good science, then they get all defensive. And if you think about it now, if that is the reaction of a drowning person who is actually convinced that the world is going to end, then you must come to the conclusion that they are not actually convinced. They are not actually interested in the world ending or something. They are attached to their views. They are 100% convinced that they are right, and they are clinging to the rightness of their views and not actually to the content. So how could you convince such a person who is clinging so hard to a view of something different? Logic, overall, is based on unknown assumptions. This is a problem. We hide the fact from ourselves that we actually are not really interested in the climate. We are interested in being right most of the time. And some of those assumptions are more important than others. And our opinions follow from them. So we have to find something that includes the flat earth, but has no attachment, and convince you indirectly. If you convince yourself that other planets, for example, are round, it will follow by indirection that the earth is possibly also round. And it is the same with the self. The other planets are more significant than Dhammas, than the flat earth, as an example. And as such, we must abandon our initial assumption. So we are looking for counterexamples. And once we have done that, you could perform the following exercise or thought experiment. Imagine being a tadpole born in the water, never having seen or experienced air or land. Your entire experience is without air or land. And now you have to try and imagine what that is like. It's impossible. You cannot imagine something that you have never experienced. I mean, you can try to imagine it, but whatever you imagine is not the same thing. You implicitly assume that water is all there is. But once you grow up and train your mind, you break through the water surface and the knowledge arises. Oh, this is what water is like. I did not even know that it was pressuring me. Some things can only be known and seen afterwards. And it is true for the self especially. Once it is gone, you notice what is missing now. And one more thing on how knowledge can remove pain or suffering. For example, imagine that you were having some trouble breathing, maybe having a panic attack, which is something that is usually happening at the same time. And you decide to go to a checkup at the doctor. and he is not quite sure what is wrong with you, and you are admitted to the hospital for a series of tests. Most people would already be very nervous and very worried at that point. And if the doctor then gives you the diagnosis of lung cancer, how would you feel? Simply the knowledge has changed. Before that, you did not even notice, except for having a slight cough. And then, well, anyway, so your knowledge has changed and you are suffering greatly. And if the doctor later realizes that he made a mistake and maybe mixed up your file with another file and explains that you just had a cold, you would experience immense relief and joy. And the simple false knowledge of cancer will turn your entire life upside down. And it is the same with the insights that we are trying to attain in Buddhism, but much more intense by magnitudes. What you essentially understand is that death does not apply to you. So you are freed from death, at least to some degree, and free from the fear of death. And this brings about quite a bit of relief. Yeah. And now, based on all of this, we can come to the heart of the Dhamma, which is the essence of the video today. And I want to be very, I want to make very sure that this point is carried home with you. So first of all, you can approach the heartwood in terms of different angles. There are various different ways in which the Buddha has taught the very same thing in the suttas. And I like the simile given in the Life of the Buddha book. It's like looking at a tree from various different angles. Many approaches can be used to explain the very same thing. There's, for example, the approach of the Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path. There's the approach of the gradual training. There's the approach of the three marks. There's the approach through dependent origination directly. And there are many more other approaches that you can use to understand the same Dhamma. And I want to start with the three marks. The three marks are something that the Buddha mentioned quite often, and he called them developed universal perceptions. At any given time, you can develop, as an example, the perception and understanding, or the attention towards, let's put it like that, anicca and dukkha, and as a result, you can develop the perception of anatta. And seeing anicca, seeing the impossibility to own, the impossibility to control, will lead to non-ownership, will lead to non-control, will lead to non-self. And seeing dukkha, as an example, uproots the value of going for certain things, and as such you stop that and can actually see the lack of ownership, the lack of control. And this is what the Buddha called, usually, seeing with wisdom. And seeing these three marks is more significant than logic. You can uproot your wrong and even hidden views using something like that. Because implicitly, what we see there, seeing the unownability, conflicts with our sense of control. And as such, if we do it often enough and thoroughly enough, we will see through this kind of illusion of control, as we are no longer distracting ourselves from that. And all three marks are aspects of the very same thing. Anatta follows from the others. What is impermanent is suffering. What is suffering is non-self, as we have learned, for example, from Samyutta Nikaya number 35.1. And anicca, or sankhara anicca, is often misunderstood, a very misunderstood characteristic of experience. It precedes logic and reasoning, and it's about what must be there for logic to work. For example, for us to perform any kind of logic, things have to change, as an example. So, yeah, anicca, or change overall, is more significant than logic. To perform any kind of logic, to perform any kind of reasoning, to perform any kind of thinking, anything like that, there must first be anicca. And it's often implicit and not included in any of our ways of logic and reasoning. And it's always subjective. And we need to apply the perception of anicca where we have the feeling of control. So wherever we feel like we have control, we should contradict that with bringing that back to some basis, to some origin, to some womb, to some source, where we know that we have no control. Like, when we want to see that our craving is not our own, as an example, we have to see that it relies, for example, on something like a feeling that just changes on its own, where we are absolutely certain and know that that thing just changes. And anicca is totally not about objective flux or something. It is deeply personal. It is the knowledge of things being already there. And seeing anicca correctly implies understanding dependent origination. It implies the knowledge of the Dhamma. It implies having the right view, essentially. So truly seeing anicca only really becomes available after having the right view. And many people are trying to perform anicca meditations. And in a sense, they can do that, but just as an aspirational practice, in the sense that they are trying to do it right, but have not fully understood it yet. So whatever they do, as long as they acknowledge that what they do is not right, and that they are trying to getting it right, that's probably good and can be helpful. But when they assume that their understanding of anicca is already the real deal, then what they do is wrong. And anicca has certain aspects, for example, an aspect of arising, an aspect of ceasing, and an aspect of enduring. Those are the three aspects of change. Impermanence can be seen in those three ways, but based on the assumption of control, it will always be experienced as uncomfortable. It has aspects of things getting more of what they are, things getting less of what they are, and things enduring while changing to some degree. And it's not increasing, enduring, changing, ceasing. It's in that order that it's usually stated in the suttas. And of all of them, presuppose the there-ness in our mundane experience. And some monks can discern anicca in any of those three ways. Any of us has a natural inclination towards seeing one of those aspects first or last. Yeah. And the first or last point of anything, which is what many modern practices want us to do, can never really be discerned, simply because things have to be already there. They have to be presented to ourselves by whatever for us to make any statement about the changing nature of that. First they are there, and then they become more, become less, or change. And discerning any first or last point would require a stepping out of experience, and that would require a self. That would require these wrong assumptions that we try to get rid of. And many modern practitioners fall for that, because much of that is actually taught in modern schools of Buddhism. This is a very big hindrance. You cannot actively stop control. It comes through dispassion. You must tame your heart so that it accepts this kind of non-control, and then it will be accessible to you. Yeah. And you can think of in terms of anicca as an experiment to convey the significance of that word. Imagine being a prisoner to be executed in the very near future. Before the dreaded day, you can voice one last wish and enjoy whatever pleasure you have. You could ask for whatever you desire, except for things that delay the inevitable. Would you be able to enjoy your last meal, movie, or whatever you choose? Can there be any anicca that is not accompanied by sankhara dukkha? And the answer is very likely no. There's only one thing would be on your mind: your imminent execution. The only reason we can mindlessly enjoy sense pleasures is the fact that we ignore our own impermanence. When our body is impermanent, and the body is our tool that we use to get pleasure, then the pleasure is no longer significant. Why? Because the body is threatened. And this is very important to keep in mind. So everything that is anicca is also dukkha. And this leads us to sankhara dukkha, what it is and what it is not. Dukkha, with a capital D, is our sickness, so to speak. We are suffering. And dukkha with a small d is a symptom of our sickness. We are affected by the dukkha and are suffering the symptoms from it. And dukkha is the experiential symptom of ignorance. It's not only battlefield kind of suffering, it's all kinds of suffering possible. All kinds of lack, all kinds of things that we experience. And it's non-contentment, non-peacefulness. Dukkha is the aversion to arisen experience, wanting things to be different. And it is what we try to overcome in Buddhism. Dukkha is suffering, insecurity, unease. And sukha would be the opposite of that. Sukha is what we try to develop. We want to develop liberation. We want to develop a sense of ease, lightness, peace in the practice. And you can reveal suffering. To really understand suffering, you have to deny your senses their wishes for a time and interrupt your usual routines. Simply pause before following your wishes. A few minutes are usually sufficient, or even a few seconds in many cases. How is it? Really allow yourself to feel into that kind of experience of not getting what you want right now. Well, the initial sense restraint is usually accompanied by craving and suffering, and a lot of pressure to fix that craving, to fix that suffering, to fix that feeling, to fix that bad feeling that you have to experience right now. And the longer you restrain your senses, the stronger the pressure will become. And this will lead to an intuitive understanding of craving or suffering or dukkha, and shows you that the only reason that you regard your desires as good is that you immediately act out of them. They oppress you. And the pleasure of sensuality is mainly the removal of the pain of craving. This is what we get through sensuality. This is the gratification of it. There is a moment of relief afterwards, but it comes at the cost of being even more under the whim of our own cravings and feelings. And anatta would be the last of the developed perceptions, the last of the 3 marks of experience. And self requires the 5 aggregates, or those separate heaps that we talked about before, to formulate. And those 5 aggregates are, in the normal case, the aggregates affected by clinging. And the self would be the owner-controller, or an entity external to the experience as it presents itself. We always have the feeling that we are separate from those aggregates and are watching from afar. And for when a person perceives impermanence, perception of non-self becomes established in him, is what the suttas say. So when we contradict our basic default assumption of control, then we experience non-control. Anatta would be the ownerlessness, masterlessness, non-externalness. This is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself. There is sense of self, usually based on ignorance, but even that sense of self is not yours. And because all sankharas are impermanent, because all conditions are impermanent and suffering, all things, all the immediate experiences that we have are non-self. And if you want to see anatta rightly, you must try to see anicca and dukkha rightly for sufficiently long without any confirmation to gain the right view. And it varies from person to person how much you have to do or undo that, how much you have to nudge your heart to see that rightly. This is very important. Yeah. And one experiment that I like to do quite a lot was an experiment that usually gets you an inkling of what we are talking about here. You could sit down in meditation and restrain your senses. In essence, you want to calm the hindrances. Endure all cravings and the pressures of arising bad feelings until they vanish from your mind and it is clear and bright and without any immediate desire. Then stop the formal meditation and try to predict what part of your body will move next, what your eyes might do next, where you might scratch next, the head movement, the breathing, or any other movement. Just try to accurately and honestly guess what will happen next or after that. If you truly are in control, you would absolutely be able to do that. But chances are very good that you can't predict any of those things, and thus cannot be the master and controller of those things. The more honest you are, the fewer things will appear to be under your control. And this is why enlightenment is sometimes compared to realizing life as a dream. Or even the other way around. Before that you think it's real, and afterwards you notice, oh, this is a dream. All of this is just a dream. And this also works with your thoughts, with your intentions, with everything. You have no idea what you will want next, what you will think next, or what you will think after your next thought or something like that. None of that can be controlled. None of that is within your domain. Yet we are always living like we want those things, like we feel those things, like we experience those things. So we can contradict that through certain kinds of thought experiments. Okay, now we actually come to the very important chain of dependent origination, to the wheel of arising. I took this here from Lee Brasington's book. And just a short reminder, to understand any of that in your experience, to experience dependent origination, you must devalue sensuality quite significant before, through like a divine messenger event, death contemplation, some other event that induces a sense of urgency. And it is a precondition to see anicca. Anicca means seeing the true Dhamma. Anicca breaks the prison for the mind. And you want to do that through understanding and realizing dependent origination. And I have prepared a short diagram here, and this is how it usually starts. You can contemplate dependent origination in both ways, forward and backward, but I like this way more because it intuitively makes more sense to most people. So let's start with the last element actually, namely with suffering, aging, death, and decay. And instead of thinking in terms of follows from or is directly implied by, let's think in terms of depends upon, dependent origination. What does suffering depend upon? Suffering depends on a self. It depends on birth. It depends on being. So the self has to be born. And that, in turn, depends on existence, on bhava, on being something, which in turn depends on an implicit clinging, on the upadana, on the self-view, which in turn depends on craving, on my craving, on me wanting, which depends on my feeling, me feeling something, which depends on having the ownership of feeling, which in turn depends on owning the contact with a sense of self, which depends on the sixth sense basis, or the body, owning that body, which in turn depends on owning namarupa, owning name and form, my matter, my name, my vijnana, my consciousness, which in turn depends on my intentions, my fabrications, which depends on not knowing the Dhamma, not knowing the Four Noble Truths. And usually, when this chain of dependent origination is explained, for example, in the book Visuddhimagga, it is always stretched out through 3 lifetimes. All the terms in parentheses, like self or my, mine, me, self, whatever, those are ignored. Yet the entire chain of dependent origination is about nothing else but this part. You don't want to remove all the possible sankharas or something like that, even though the Sutta state is a stilling of all sankharas. But what we actually want to still is all the sankharas that are relevant for suffering. We don't want to remove experience as it is. We want to remove the suffering from our experience. What the Buddha often said is that craving, or greed, aversion, and delusion are the 3 poisons. What we want to do is remove the poison from our experience, not the entirety. It would be foolish to remove the more than necessary. You want to remove exactly the poisonous arrow that you have been shot by. You don't want to remove the leg. You just want to remove that part that is causing you the suffering. Why would you remove anything else than that? And what we can do here is take any of those elements here and understand the relationship with the other elements. If we, for example, are quite convinced that feeling is not within your domain, that you cannot really control it, then you can try to see the connection between feeling and, for example, your sense of self, your sense of being, your sense of control, or whatever, or your craving even, your wanting. And then you can see, okay, there's a feeling right now, and it changes all the time. I have no control over that changing at all, yet I assume to want that feeling, to control that feeling through my intentionality. And this will at some point lead to a contradiction. And the good thing is, you can remove the ignorance, the non-knowing of the Dhamma from any of those links. It's not like you have to remove those links or something like that. You have to understand them. You have to realize the connection. You have to realize how, for example, clinging to feeling leads to suffering. This is the understanding that you want to generate. This is the understanding that you want to experience. Again, it is an experience of dependent origination and not something, I don't know, stupid. Anyway, it's very important to highlight the prerequisites that are necessary to understand any of that. A reactive mind cannot clearly see, cannot properly be mindful, cannot remember any of that. It is forgetful. A reactive mind is a non-virtuous mind. It's like muddy water. And reacting means losing sight of the source, of the womb, of the background of experience. No matter how you want to phrase it, it's always the same. If you're absorbed in the objects of your senses, you cannot capture the bigger picture. This is what is important. And if you always cover up your dukkha, you can never calmly examine it. You can never understand how you, in that very situation, are causing yourself to suffer. How you keep yourself, as the suttas say, in a maimed and injured condition. You must learn to let things endure in the mind. It is like training an animal. You want to train your heart with your intellect, with your mind. You want to train that animal. And that animal, what are usually compared with a feral dog or with a wild elephant, something that is really hard to train and much stronger than you. And knowing 2 things at once, this womb attention, this is absolutely necessary to understand anything Dhamma related. And to attain insight into dukkha, you must allow it to endure in the mind. Otherwise, you cannot inspect it, you cannot understand the role you play in the entire process. The reason that suffering can be removed from your experience is that you are doing your suffering. You are fueling your suffering through your actions and through your non-knowledge. And again, I want to repeat the exercise of the snow globe. Imagine that your mind is one of those glass orbs with snow inside that you can shake. If you constantly shake it and turn it this way or that way, or try to inspect it, or really try hard to get insight about it, investigate it, would you see what is inside? You would not. It is the same with your mind. Our actions of greed, aversion, and delusions shake the mind and make it foggy. Only once we learn how we cause the brain fog, so to speak, can we learn how to stop this, and the mind will settle down on its own. We don't actively calm the mind. We don't take all the snowflakes and put them down. They will calm on their own as soon as we remove the fueling process that shakes up all the snow. We calm the mind by no longer making it agitated, and then the rest will happen naturally. This is how the practice can develop quite naturally. This is how it works. And again, you want to do that in a proof by contradiction manner. You can contemplate in this way. If you are in control, why don't you have exclusively good feelings? What kind of feelings are you? Self is a unity, by the way. Are you the good feeling, the bad feeling, the neutral feeling? If you are in control, why can't you predict your next thought, word, or deed? If you are in control, why don't you perceive exclusively beautiful things? I would do that if I could. If your self is permanent, why can't you make a thought, word, or deed stay eternally? The mind is a truth-seeking machine, in a sense. Understanding reality increases our chances of survival, understanding anything really, how anything works. And the mind rapidly changes its assumptions when presented with contradicting evidence. And the Buddha never said that we should just believe him. He suggested that we take what we falsely believe at face value and then lead it to a contradiction with observable reality. We want to experience that what we take to be true is wrong. We are 100% convinced that our views and opinions are right. And as such, we have to indirectly overcome those possible views. And as an example, the easiest way to convince someone that gravity is wrong is to show him how to float. And once you do that, well, there's no room for doubting that anymore. Suppose we have a self that is permanent in control. Take anything where you feel like you have control. What would follow from that? Well, you would only have good experiences, but you haven't. And this all depends. All those different angles depend on your character type, by the way. Not all of them will work for each and every person. You have to find out what works for you. There's a lot of trial and error involved. And to undermine the sense of self, you do not try to get rid of things. Instead, you want to inspect them, quite neutrally. You put dependent origination into practice. Your unknown assumption required an indirect approach. Instead of counteracting suffering through sensuality, you remove what suffering relies upon. Suffering relies on craving, and that relies on feeling. So what must you do first? Well, first, you must remove the craving through your conduct, as your craving depends on your conduct. Like a drug addict is considered to be addicted because he goes through the actions of taking his drugs all the time. First, that has to be done. And then you can contemplate further. You can see that the craving, as an example, that is still there on the level of the mind, let's put it like that, relies on a feeling that you cannot control. It's already there, it changes on its own. Suddenly, you are in an experience where there's a good feeling, where there's a bad feeling, where there's a neutral feeling. And seeing this, that it just changes. Remembering that it just changes, and then seeing it at the same time. Oh, my experience now has changed, and you see that as it happens, so to speak. This will uproot this base assumption that our suffering relies upon. Everything that relies on feeling then fades too. Suffering can no longer arise in the same way as before. And this is, by the way, one of the differences that the Buddha stated when it comes to a noble disciple versus an unenlightened practitioner. One of them feels detached, and the other does not. Yeah. And you want to focus on significant aspects of reality that include everything, like through the 5 aggregates, that include every possible experiences, through the 6 senses, through Namarupa and Vijnana. Those are the contemplations that really matter. Feeling can also be one, because everything that matters in your experience is what you feel. Your entire experience converges upon the point of feeling, is what the Buddha said, and you really want to make it spotless. Wrong views are beginningless and infinite. You have infinitely many possible wrong views and cravings towards certain things that we could have. And this cannot be undone one by one. We have to focus on something sufficiently general and sufficiently indirect. We have to focus on those categories. And the popular models that the Buddha mentioned as before are the 6 senses, the 5 aggregates, Namarupa and Vijnana, feelings, intentions, all those things. You want to find a set of aspects of those things, you can even mix them if you wish, that cover everything. And usually our idea of craving and suffering is very incomplete. Even our idea of the 5 aggregates or feelings is very incomplete. And many things are not included. And as such, whatever our understanding of dependent origination is, it is not spotless. And the true Dhamma eye only arises when everything is seen rightly, when there's nothing that is excluded anymore, when everything is seen to be subject to the same principle of Dhamma. This is what we try to end up at. And again, just to highlight this hierarchical approach, in the middle of the Venn diagram, what we are usually confined to is wanting certain images, wanting certain smells, wanting certain sound, thoughts, touches, or tastes, or in essence, wanting sensuality. And this relies on the more general kind of craving, which relies on having values. We only want to eat chocolate when we want to have good feelings, as an example. And as such, we can go further and further outwards and detach or unattach ourselves from more and more specific parts of our experience and move towards more and more general parts where it actually can matter to make a difference. When we stop clinging to feelings fully, then we are actually arahants. And this is a very important difference. And now one more exercise when it comes to this kind of conditionality. This is from one of the suttas where Nandaka, one of the Buddha's disciples, compared dependent origination with a growing tree. Imagine the roots of the tree. Are they impermanent? The branches, the leaves. And now imagine something completely different, namely the shadow of the tree. It's in a completely different domain and not really related to the tree, right? But there is a certain kind of conditionality involved. It would be foolish to say that the shadow of the tree is not impermanent if one of the other things is. The shadow is fully determined. It fully relies upon. It has the tree, the impermanent tree, as its origin, as its source, as its womb, in a non-temporal fashion, by things outside of its domain. In the same way, our current discomfort depends like leaves on a branch, which depends on craving on a feeling. And that feeling, however, has arisen on its own. So how could we ever control or own it? You can directly experience that your sense of self is determined like the shadow of a tree. And I really like to explain this like a shadow. If your body, as an example, changes a bit, then there might be a good feeling suddenly. And whenever there is a good feeling, there's suddenly lust arising. And based on that lust, a sense of self arises, and there's also suffering, because you want more of that lust. But if the body only changes so slightly, there might be suddenly a bad feeling. And then there is a hateful and averse approach. And then a sense of self arises that has to fix the hatred, that has to fix the pressure. And then there's suffering. And this is kind of problematic. As you can see, the self comes only into being quite late. There has to be a lot of things going on first, and then in response to that, the self arises. But the self always acts like it comes first. But it does not. It arises last, so to speak. There's only suffering that might come a bit later. And if there's a neutral feeling, again, the body changes, now there's a neutral feeling, and we want to distract ourselves from that. And the self arises to perform that kind of distraction. And as a result, we experience suffering. Why? Because we are paired with what we do not want. We do not want to be bored. We do not want the neutral feeling. We want pleasure. We want good feelings. And the absence of bad feelings. That is what we usually want. And to end up at this, we usually have to perform some kind of contemplation. This is what many of the modern traditions actually do not do. Sometimes they even deny that contemplation is something that has been done in the suttas. But it's quite clear. If you read the suttas, you see that the monks, they have contemplated and interrogated and discussed all the time. So it has to be some part of the practice. The entire approach of contemplation dates back to the Vedas, which were already old at the time of the Buddha. And this was one of the main methods that the Buddha performed. You essentially try to understand a vague concept better by musing or dwelling on that topic. You want to clarify your views or ideas on certain practices, on certain words. For example, you want to understand better what a feeling is. And then you sit down and bring the term feeling to mind. You don't try to answer certain questions or anything. You just bring it to mind and dwell on it. Try to realize what it means to feel something in your experience. Or when it comes to the first jhana, you should delay that until you are at least close to it when it comes to your conduct, and then you can think about it. Or you want to understand, am I still subject to sickness, old age, and death? And there are many more approaches. But it is all amusing. You want to clarify something that you have learned in terms of instructions or understanding or something like that in your own experience. You want to find it, you want to realize it. And there are many different contemplations, subjects, or topics that essentially do the same thing. And again, for each of those things, you want to align your idea of suffering, of craving, of feeling, of the Four Noble Truths, of dependent origination, with what the actual thing is. You want to understand what the Buddha actually meant by those things. You don't want an idea of suffering, you want the idea of suffering that the Buddha meant. This is what should be the result of contemplation. Before you can actually train your heart in any targeted manner, you have to consciously understand what to do to some degree. Otherwise, you cannot reward the mind when it did something good, or punish it, or present it with something disagreeable when it does something bad, simply because you do not know. You can only train an animal in a targeted manner when you know how to train it, when you know it yourself. Otherwise, it's not possible. And there are some ways that can be quicker than others. For example, you could perform mindfulness of death, which is just remembering that you are subject to dying, that your body could stop working at any given moment. And once you notice that, well, the sensuality is not really meaningful anymore, because you would not buy a house that is about to burn down or something like that. That is not something that we do. We immediately shy away from that. And death, in essence, means that we lose everything that is dear to us. Death is too abstract most of the time, and we don't really want to think about it, as we are deeply afraid of that. It leads to panic or even feelings of terror. And as such, we can perform the mindfulness of death much better through contemplating losing all the things or persons that are dear to us. This is what death implies, usually. Death is bad in the ultimate context of life because it will separate us from everything that is dear to us. This is why we hate death. If there were nothing that we would value or hold dear to us, then there would be nothing to lose. And this kind of practice, if you perform it rightly, can be extremely quick, but it's a very dangerous even kind of practice that has gone wrong at various times in the suttas, or at least at one time, as it is has been leading to a mass suicide. I'm not sure if it was actually the death contemplation or the asubha, the disgust contemplations of the body. I tend to mix those up. Feel free to let me know what it really was. Right now, when I think about it, it was actually probably the asubha, as a disgust contemplation. But anyway, the point is, you can do such things in a wrong manner. And if you contemplate death, it might as well drive you to suicide. And then there are other approaches that you can also use. You can take apart your experience and separate it in yet another way. For example, the form part, the rupa part, can be separated into the different building blocks, namely earth, water, fire, and sometimes space and consciousness. Or in different ways, you can take your sense of sight, as an example, and separate it into the colors that are involved in the entire process. The idea is that we have certain views about the whole thing, namely about form, about our body, and have attachments to it. But if we separate it into its building blocks, then we are usually not attached to those. We are not attached to the earthy part, to the stability part, to the resistance part of the body. We are attached to the entirety of the body. We are not attached to the water part, to the fire, to the wind, or whatever. We are attached to the whole. And by separating it into the different parts, we can actually detach a bit more from it. And we can also notice dependent origination through that, because we surely don't hold the view that we can control the watery aspect of our experience, of our subjective experience, or the heat part. I mean, I cannot control my body heat, as an example. That's foolish. Nobody would think that. And when you now understand that the entirety of your experience kind of depends on your body heat, then you are close to the Dhamma, understanding that experientially. And there are many possible pairs. There's even a sutta from the Sutta Nipata number 3.12, where the Buddha lists countless different possible subjects of contemplation. I think it's close to 20 or 40. I cannot remember anymore, but it was a huge list. And there he offered various different angles and approaches to understand dependent origination. With the source, there is a result at the same time. This is a basic principle of dependent origination. With feeling, with being attached to feeling, there is craving. With the six senses, there are images. With craving, there is suffering. With ignorance of any of the relationships, with ignorance of any of those links, there is suffering. A single subject, however, is enough. You have to just use one link. You have to understand the dependence and the implication between two links. You have to remove the ignorance between two links, and then you have technically broken the entire chain and made a breakthrough to the Dhamma. This is what you want to do. This is what you want to achieve. And the result of all of that would be the right view. The practical seeing of another for the first time. The first seeing of another is usually, at least I would say, it's profound. It's like being born blind and then seeing for the first time. Take anything where you feel or assume control, which is everything pretty much, and notice the dependence on things outside of control. With this is. Without this is not. And this depends on your individual views and assumptions. And they are useful, significant pairs, again from Lord Sutta, reliance on an uncontrollable body, on the senses, on feelings. Those are the things that I have encountered most often. And the result is a bit like in this exercise here. Imagine playing a video game with an elder brother or a friend as a kid. You have a controller in your hand and you are fully absorbed in the game. You lean left and right if you are playing, I don't know, Mario Kart or something like that. And you feel frustrated when something fails and delight when it works. And now imagine you have to scratch yourself and notice that the game continues. You decide to investigate and notice that your controller was not plugged in. Would you be able to maintain the same sense of attachment and absorbedness? Would you be able to be enchanted still and involved in the game? Would you suffer as much when your character dies? Likely not. You become disenchanted and dispassionate, and through that you become liberated from the spell of the game. Nibbana comes through this passion. When you notice, I cannot control any of that, and you are no longer as passionate about it as before, which is the gist of it all. You can no longer re-engage with sensuality in the same way when you notice that it is not yours. And the result is a breakthrough to the Dhamma. There are several ways, in my opinion at least, how those are displayed in the suttas. And the most common one is when someone has heard the Dhamma from the Buddha. And then it usually goes as follows. Excellent Master Gautama, excellent Master Gautama. Master Gautama has made the Dhamma clear in many ways, as though he were turning upright what had been overthrown, revealing what was hidden, showing the way to one who was lost, or holding up a lamp in the darkness, so that those with good eyesight can see form. As I see it, sure that many people will not agree with me. This is a statement where someone attains the right view. You have fixed this overthrown order of things. Usually we assume that the sense of self comes first, but it actually comes second. You turn upright what has been overthrown. You correct what has been wrong all the time. And in essence, the snippet even states, the Master Gautama has made the Dhamma clear in many ways, not something useless. And in essence, the suttas only really talk about the Dhamma. So it's only really worth capturing something like that if it concerns itself with the Dhamma. And this is from Majjhima Nikaya number 56, which is one of the suttas which actually contains two different statements, I think. One where there's a spotless liberation of Upali, and before that, the made the Dhamma clear in many ways statement. And Ajahn Chah also had a certain statement from Unshakable Peace, where he states the following. Afterward, the whole world is upside down. Your understanding of reality is completely different. Your view is utterly transformed. If someone saw you at that moment, they might think you were insane. If this experience happened to someone who did not have a thorough grip on themselves, they might actually go crazy, because nothing is the same as it was before. The people of the world appear different than they used to, but you are the only one who sees it. Absolutely everything changes. Your thoughts are transmuted. Other people now think in one way, while you think in another. This is a level of significance. This is how it is. At least as I understand it, it's an earth-shattering experience. Unless you are sublimely established in virtue and have done lots of work before, and all those things do not fall into place at once, but in many, many different tiny pieces. Then I can imagine that it's not an earth-shattering experience, as it's then the accumulation of all the parts. And there are different ways to the realization of dream entry, as for Majjhima Nikaya number 60. But noble always implies the right view. There's, for example, the Dhamma follower, who has a reflexive acceptance of the teachings, and accepted them due to logic and reasoning, and he always has sufficient wisdom. He has the faculties or potentials for faith, energy, mindfulness, concentration, and wisdom. And always also sufficient wisdom, as in he has seen enough of dependent origination. Same for the faith follower, who is another person who has attained the right view, so to speak, who is not yet a full Sotapanna. He has faith and love for the triple gem. And he has the potentials of faith, energy, mindfulness, concentration, and wisdom too. And he also has sufficient wisdom. Again, very important. Basically, he has the right view without experiencing the full fruit of it, the full realization of it, but without that feeling, so to speak. Those two kinds of people exist. And then there's a breakthrough. Just as the dawn heralds and foretells the rising of the sun, so right view heralds and foretells the penetration to the Four Noble Truths according as they really are. From Samyutta Nikaya number 56.37. It removes avijja, as I see it, from exactly one link, and then you become a Dhamma follower or a faith follower. And the full right view, if your craving has already been very weak, would be seeing the entire chain in relation to suffering and ignorance. You unsuffer yourself and experience this great relief. And you could, again, try to understand the breakthrough to the Dhamma, to the Four Noble Truths, as an inner dialogue, a eureka effect. Oh, this is suffering. Ah, yes, this is how suffering comes to be, and this is how it vanishes. And this thing that I have been doing all the time, this was actually the right kind of practice that the Buddha gave me. Yeah. And then there's a stream entry, the full stream entry, so to speak, which is usually phrased as follows in the suttas. Then the Blessed One gave the householder Upali progressive instructions, that is, talk on giving, talk on virtue, the blessings of renunciation. And when he knew that the householder Upali's mind was ready, he expounded to him the teachings special to the Buddhas. Suffering, its origin, its cessation, and the path. Just as a clear cloth with all marks removed would take dye evenly, the spotless, immaculate vision of the Dhamma arose in him. All that is subject to arising is subject to cessation. Then the householder Upali saw the Dhamma, attained the Dhamma, penetrated the Dhamma. He crossed beyond doubt, did away with perplexity, gained intrepidity, and became independent of others in the Buddha's dispensation. And this is true from Majjhima Nikaya number 56. This is usually what the full breakthrough to the Dhamma looks like. And if you think in terms of the 10 fetters model, the practitioner understands that any type of rule or observance or blind virtue is just that, a method. It's blind, it's devoid of wisdom. It will lead to falling back. Yet the Dhamma leads to none falling back. You understand the difference between weakening and craving and completely destroying it so that it cannot come back. Further, the practitioner understands that there's no external controlling self. He completely abandons the self-view in any of the 5 aggregates. No part of the body, of the feelings, of perceptions, of formations of sankharas and consciousness holds any self, any control. The practitioner is no longer influenced by doubt as he understands the training now and recognizes the nature of doubt as non-self too. You are no longer affected fundamentally by doubt. You have removed that as you have seen the truth. And depending on your craving, depending on the virtues that you have cultivated before you heard the Dhamma, any of the stages of awakening can be the result of attaining the right view. You can immediately become a Sotapanna, a faith follower, a Dhamma follower, or even an Arahant, if you are very, very virtuous. And there are many names for the same thing, for stream entry. Stream entry could be phrased as the understanding of the Dhamma, the attainment of the Dhamma, a breakthrough to the Dhamma, a breakthrough to the Four Noble Truths, the right view. Stream entry, Sotapanna, Sotapatti, an independence of a teacher, having unshakable faith in the Dhamma, understanding dependent origination, the knowledge of the noble ones, the knowledge of the arising and passing of phenomena, the knowledge of the arising and cessation, the opening of the Dhamma eye, as you can now see the Dhamma, the being an Arya, being a noble one, the knowledge of the 3 poisons, and many, many more different things. Most importantly, it would probably be the knowledge of the breakthrough to the Four Noble Truths. But again, like 15 or 20 different ways of phrasing the same thing. So don't mix those things up and expect them to be a different thing. And what is left after attaining stream entry? The Buddha described that, for example, in Samyutta Nikaya number 13.5, with a simile of the balls of clay or grains of sand. Monks suppose that a man would place 7 little balls of clay, the size of jujube kernels, on the great earth. What do you think, monks? Which is more? Those 7 little balls of clay, the size of jujube kernels, that have been placed there, or the great earth? Venerable Sir, the great earth is more. The 7 little balls of clay, the size of jujube kernels, are trifling. They do not amount to 100s, 1,000s, or 100,000th part of the great earth. So 2 monks for a noble disciple, of such great benefit is it to obtain the vision of the Dhamma. All that is left, in this life, by the way, is 7 tiny grains of sand, earth of suffering. And the great earth who is of suffering is gone. This is why it is so significant, and why the vast majority of cases in the suttas are actually of people making a breakthrough to the Dhamma and not necessarily becoming arahants. Yet, this breakthrough to the Dhamma is worth writing down for later generations. It's worth tracking. And the practical effects are as following. Normal people can only cope via sensuality to cover up suffering. They drink, they eat chocolate, they gamble, they engage in sensuality. Noble ones have destroyed the ultimate root. They don't have to do that anymore. The most suffering simply cannot arise anymore for them. The noble one does not have to do anything for that to happen. It just is the way it is. They have seen and realized the Dhamma, and they know the way out of suffering. They know what must be done to seal the deal, even though the vast majority of the suffering cannot arise anymore. There's still some work to do. There are still old habits. You can still fuel the proximate cause of your suffering again for a limited time. You can still do your suffering out of habit. It is just that the ultimate root is the self-view is gone. So you can still stall to some degree, but you cannot fall back anymore. And just because you have understood the Dhamma experientially does not even mean that you can teach it. It is possible that there are anagamis or possibly even arahants who are worse at teaching than mere faith followers. Well, faith followers maybe not because they rely on faith, but Dhamma followers as an example. Yeah. And you can also think of it in terms of a poisonous drink. Suppose that there was a delicious drink in front of you. It smells great, tastes great, and you have drank it many times before. Would you drink it again? Very likely. And now suppose you find out with absolute certainty that someone has laced your drink with an indetectable poison. The poison will invoke death or deadly suffering in a number of years from now. Could you drink the drink with the same kind of enjoyment as before? The answer is no. You can only engage in something harmful if we ignore the harmfulness in it. Once craving is directly seen as suffering, we can no longer ignore it as before, and from that moment onwards, our hearts will incline towards renunciation, and no longer towards engagement with sensuality. Depending on the strength of our habits, we might be in the game for a long time, but ultimately, the overall direction will always be renunciation from then on. And you can also think of it in terms of a safe island. Knowing the poisons, you cannot drink it anymore. You can eat around the bait, so to speak. The stream enterer knows that there is safety inside. That is tremendous relief. He knows how to break out of the prison of his experience. It is not rare that people cry of joy, sometimes even for weeks. And it's an earth-shattering experience. You have found a place where death, even death, cannot touch you. It is a way to the safe shore, to the deathless. This is so significant that the Buddha called anyone who understood it noble. There's only a limited time of distraction, so to speak, from the Dhamma. And all you have to do is not distract yourself from that truth anymore, and you would automatically end up at the final goal. And circumstances will make it impossible for you to distract yourself all the time, which is why there is a guarantee that you end up at liberation. Now dwell alone in seclusion, independent of a teacher. That is a valid option once you have understood the Dhamma. But even then, even arahants were still discussing the Dhamma from time to time. And it is very beneficial. You have to find the right balance. I would not go to dwell in seclusion alone if you have not attained the vision of the Dhamma. And then there are some remaining habits. A stream enterer still has habits of aversion, of lust and ignorance. He can even break the precept as a householder. As a monk, that's not so clear, but as a householder, he can absolutely do that. And the shallow roots of sensuality are yet to be removed. Think of it as layers or hierarchies of different roots. For example, there is a plant, a weed in the fields, which is called bindweed. And it has thin and wide roots that are all over the place, but it also has a very deep root ball, like 2 or 3 meters down in the earth, and that thing is gone for a sotapanna. But all the smaller surface level roots are still there. Those you have to pull. Sensuality can still arise. You can still become negligent. And it requires the dwelling in samadhi, in jhana, free from the hindrances, to convince the heart, to really pull all those surface level roots so that there can be no further arising of greed, aversion, and delusion. You remove all the distractions and make the Dhamma spotless, which is what arahantship is. Nothing that your heart could do, nothing could convince the heart to pick up greed, aversion, or delusion again. Regression is impossible, as even forgetting and remembering are seen rightly. The Dhamma, from stream entry onwards, is doing itself. And now, Just one more word on transcending methods. The path in itself, even if I call it a path in singular, is actually a basket. It's a misconception of a single path. The Eightfold Path is a general framework with certain stepping stones and certain things that must be developed. But there's a lot of room for individual development. You don't have to walk exactly the same way as, I don't know, Ajahn Chah or something like that. Your circumstances are different, and you will become more like Ajahn Chah, so to speak, or more arahantish the more you practice. This is the one thing where people converge towards. But apart from that, the training can be very versatile, can be very different looking. What matters is the internal intentions. Your intentions of greed, aversion, and delusion are abandoned. And those are very individual for all people. There are many possible specific personal paths. The specifics do not matter. What matters is the presence of craving and how you go about it, how you decondition it. And all working practices can be sorted into that. What you do is you remove the greed, aversion, and delusion. And this is what we try to achieve. The Buddha only really stated that whatever grosser beings are to enter or leave this city of Nibbana, so to speak, they will all have to go through this gate. In the same way, Lord, I have come to know the Dhamma. No matter what you do, you have to abandon craving, you have to abandon ignorance. Whatever else you do does not really matter. So there is diversity when it comes to that. There's diversity when it comes to the training. There are lots and ups and downs, and they do not look the same for each and every practitioner. But certain things have to be part of every bit of practice of every single practitioner. And you can think of it in this term. There are lots of tiles where you should not go to get from the near shore to the far shore. But what you must do is practice non-delight, non-aversion, and non-delusion. Everything else, you can make detours and go off into the dangerous domain again and come back and restart, etc. But if you want to come from here to there, from the near shore to the far shore, you have to take this path that the Buddha laid out. It has to contain those elements. You have to have virtue, samadhi, and wisdom. That is non-negotiable. And you essentially go from mere suppression to uprooting. The Dhamma starts with right view. Everything before is technically virtue and trying to getting your views straight, trying to understand the Dhamma. Virtue stops the suffering. The Dhamma ensures that the suffering stays away, that you cannot re-engage with it. And the difference could not be greater. You can remove the entirety of your suffering, basically, for ungodly amount of time from your life, and still have not even attained a spark of what a mere faith follower has attained. Large portions of people do not even practice virtue nowadays, let alone the Dhamma. Virtue alone should transform your entire life away from craving. The Dhamma just seals the deal. And very few people practice like that nowadays. They focus on much easier things with inferior results. Basically, everyone would rather just meditate for 2 hours each day instead of transforming everything. It's a much more daunting task. If you really have to throw away every attachment that you hold, undo all the attachments, undo all your wrong views, purify all your behavior at all time, that is a different beast than just meditating for 2 hours. And then there are a few myths concerning stream entry. I don't want to talk too much about that, but I want to mention it at least. In many contemporary traditions, there are some myths surrounding stream entry, and the most prominent one that I know of is the so-called cessation or fruition event myth, that path and fruit happen in quick succession, as an example, and that there's a blinking out moment out of experience. And this, as far as I understand it, dates back to the Visuddhimagga or Vimutttimagga book. And those are at best loosely correlated. There are thousands of fruition events, so to speak, before the next stage happens according to those descriptions. And the practitioners who follow those schools often claim that freedom from suffering or tanha is impossible or underwhelming. And they even question the legitimacy of the Buddha. They can completely halt any progress towards Nibbana, as they hold many wrong views. And the Buddha called wrong view the most unwholesome thing in existence, even more unwholesome than killing. And stream entry, or the right view, is an earth-shattering realization in the vast majority of cases, especially in a world where people are not as pure and not as virtuous as they might have been back in the days, where the circumstances simply did not allow for this kind of proliferation of sensuality. But also there's a word of warning. There can be many changes in understanding unrelated to Dhamma that can feel majestic, overwhelming, divine, beyond words, inexplicable. There can be insights concerning space, time, and non-duality gods can converse with you or whatnot. Yet, ultimately, you would still be a practitioner, as none of those insights are worth a dime when it comes to Buddhism. There's only one insight that matters, which would be the understanding of the fundamental principle of dependent origination. That pulls the ultimate, the deepest root of suffering. Nothing short of that is acceptable if freedom from suffering is your goal. It's not about attaining states, it is about fully understanding them. The understanding is what matters. And the Buddha also talked about attainments. So there's a warning for advanced practitioners too. I have talked about this in this iteration of the lecture quite a lot. Uprooting and severe deconditioning are hard to tell apart. You can be free from craving for countless eons on end through virtue. It will still arise again. The ultimate roots are very sturdy. An example could be from Anguttara Nikaya, Book of the Threes, number 116, the imperturbable. The infinity of space, as in attaining the fifth jhana, would free you from all suffering, basically, for 20,000 eons on end. Yet, you would be reborn in hell or the animal realms afterwards, because the good karma has been used up. Likely 40,000 or 60,000 eons for jhana number 6 and 7, and probably 80,000 eons on end of freedom for jhana number 8. If you have overcome sensuality first, so to speak, and developed samadhi, you likely think yourself to be done and have no motivation left. You can be liberated from the body, but liberation of the mind, of the heart, requires instructions. And this is from some Sutta Nikaya number 12.61. Again, based on wrong views and wrong assumptions and wrong teachings and instructions that you have received, whatever will follow will be wrong insights, wrong experience, and will be suffering. Nothing else can follow from that. Only based on right instructions, on right view, on right beliefs, right views, right knowledge, can the true liberation that the Buddha talked about be the result. This is very important. If you start with a bitter seed, whatever grows from it will also be bitter. You cannot grow a nice pumpkin from a bitter pumpkin seed. That is impossible. And that seed is a simile for the wrong or the right view. Okay, but let us now come to the most important points. I have talked long enough today. The key points of chapter 6 are as follows. Insights are understanding and not mystical experiences. The Buddha was sometimes criticized for only teaching wisdom, and he called those people fools and said that they are so stupid, essentially, that they unknowingly praise the Buddha. And the 3 marks do precede logic and have to be understood for attaining the right view. Afterwards, you have access to truly seeing anicca, dukkha, and anatta. And right view is the starting point of the path, and it transcends mere virtue. You not only unsuffer yourself, but you suddenly can make sure that suffering no longer arises in your experience. And the stream enterer has sufficient virtue and understands dependent origination experientially. He experiences dependent origination. He has seen everything as sankharas, including all parts of experience. And he sees them as anicca, which thus include all possible dhammas as non-self. And the right view has to be the most important thing if you want to attain freedom from suffering. Okay, I think this is more or less enough for today. If you have any questions or comments, put them down in the comment section, and I will probably create a video about that in the future. If you want to follow any of those links, feel free to do so. You can support me on Patreon if you wish. You can order a paperback version of this book on Amazon. You can download the free version of the ebook that will at some point in the future also contain the lecture links here. I will only update them when they are all finished. And you can join the Dhamma Discord if you want to find like-minded people. But apart from that, I wish you all a pleasant day and goodbye.